It's my great privilege to introduce the moderator for this panel, Wesley Wark. Wesley and I go back a long way. We actually have known each other on and off for about 35 years. And he hates it when I embarrass him like this, but he was my professor at the University of Toronto when I was doing my PhD all those many years ago, freshly out of the LSE, teaching me a course on British foreign policy in the 1930s. It was appeasement, as I recall. And the first paper I had to do for him, he gave me a B+, which, as you know, in a PhD, it's kind of like a fail. So I go to my supervisor, I won't mention his name, and I go, who the hell is this guy? And he just gave me a B+. And I said, can you read my paper and just tell me that this is a really great paper? And I get a call the next day and he says, actually, he's pretty generous with you. You should just take it and run. So I never finished my PhD, so I thank Wesley for that, for blowing my confidence. But I joke. Wesley is one of Canada's foremost experts and commentators on national security and intelligence. And for those of us from Canada here in the audience, they'll know Wesley extremely, extremely well. He's currently a senior fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation. He's taught in universities across Canada, at University of Toronto for a good chunk of his career, at Calgary, here at McGill. I think you're at Ottawa U for a while as well, if I'm not mistaken. He's also advised Canadian governments on numerous occasions. You're on the National Security Advisory Panel for Prime Minister Harper. You've advised public safety, CBSA, I believe. So he's a very, very prominent commentator, as I say. And I'm going to give you a little plug here because Wesley also produces a newsletter, a blog, which I have to say, honestly, is absolutely required reading for anybody in Canada who cares about national security and intelligence. It's really outstanding. I don't always agree with everything Wes says, but he always provokes me and makes me think. He really does. So if you do not subscribe, here's your plug. Subscribe. It's really well done. Wesley, over to you. Looking forward to the panel.
Thanks very much. So it's a great pleasure to be here to very gently run this very impressive panel. And I want to make sure in particular that we have lots of time before lunch for Q&A. I think I heard Vincent say that he didn't want this conference to just focus on the question of threats from the People's Republic of China, but in fact, that's going to be our topic for this panel. So bear with us on that. But I think the fascination behind the way in which this panel has been constructed is it gives us an opportunity to hear about national perspectives on national security threats, particularly from the People's Republic of China, and to think about the ways in which those national perspectives either mesh or don't. And beyond that, to think about ways in which there is some space for cooperation between Canada and the United States in dealing with some common threats. So I'm not going to go through in any extensive way the bios of our four speakers, but I do want to just give you an indication of the order in which we'll proceed and a little bit of a sense of our methodology. So the order is going to be this. We'll start with Thomas Juneau, who's to my immediate right. I want to go north-south on this. So secondly, we'll go to Craig Singleton. Thirdly, to Nicole Giles. And then we'll finish with Robert Daly. And in terms of methodology, I'm just going to really exercise a light touch. I'm going to encourage each of our speakers in order to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes in terms of their perspective on this common theme. Then at the end of that series of short presentations, kind of highlights, we'll go back. I'll ask each of the panelists if they want to reflect on anything they've heard from the panel. I might put a specific question to each of them. But after that, we're really going to open it up to the Q&A. So just very quickly, and I'll introduce each of the speakers as they come forward. We'll start with Thomas Juneau, who has just been elevated to the rank of full professor. He is a well-known academic in Canadian circles and I think beyond, with a focus on Middle East expertise, on Canadian national security and intelligence issues, on Canadian foreign policy. He teaches at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. So we'll start with Thomas, and then we'll go to Craig Singleton. Craig is a senior director of the China program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. This will be a very familiar think tank to our American colleagues, perhaps less familiar to Canadians. And Craig may want to say just a little bit about the nature of the work of that foundation. He is a former diplomat, and as is always the case with American experts, has had one of these remarkable careers moving around within and outside government in ways that never happen in Canada. And then thirdly, we're going to hear from Nicole Giles, who is a deputy director at CSIS, and her formal title is Deputy Director for Policy and Strategic Partnerships. There's a lot that fits under what we might call that chapeau in a Canadian context in terms of duties, and Nicole may say a little bit about that. CSIS has been very much in the news for all kinds of reasons, good and bad, in terms of the question of Chinese threats to national security in Canada, and very much look forward to hearing from her. And then finally, we'll hear from Robert Daly, who, as you know, is director of the Kissinger Institute on China in the United States. And I knew a lot about Robert's expertise in his bio. The thing I didn't know, which I just thought was wonderful, and he managed to bring it into the program, is that he's produced Chinese language versions of Sesame Street. So this is a man of very diverse talents, and perhaps he'll say a little bit more about how that has assisted Chinese-American relations. So I'm looking forward to this, and I'm going to turn the panel over to my colleague Tomas. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and I'll apologize right ahead that I'll be trying to stick to my notes as much as possible so that I can stay within 5, 7, 8-ish minutes. My focus will be very much on what we can do on the Canadian national security front, given the issues we're dealing with today. But before I do that, just a few assumptions that guide my thinking. Assumption number one is that multilateralism, international cooperation in the 21st century will increasingly be what Stephanie Carvin and I, in an article we did last year on AUKUS, called a potluck and not a party, in the sense that you get invited if you bring something to the table. You don't get invited just because your traditional allies like you. Assumption number two is that the US, and less importantly, other allies, are increasingly irritated by Canada's neglect of foreign defense, national security policy. We do have some assets, some skills that we bring to the table. We are not free riders, as you sometimes hear. CSC, for example, is widely viewed by our allies as an elite organization. But we are in many ways easy riders in the sense that we have a tradition of identifying that sweet spot of doing just enough. You could make a case that this was in some ways a smart, realist strategy for a while, and it worked in the sense that we did not pay a price for it. But to me, increasingly, what was for a long time the luxury of a cost-free neglect of these issues will be unsustainable. Assumption number three is that in Canada, collectively, we are not very good at thinking strategically about what we can bring to the potluck to get invited. That is, identifying the specific value added that we need to bring to the table. Too often, we want to do a bit of everything, to sprinkle our development assistance everywhere, to open embassies in countries where we have little or no interest and have only 1 or 2 staff that we can actually afford to send. We need to think much more seriously about niches and about the tough choices and trade-offs that have to come to identify these niches. That is especially true if Trump wins in 2024, but even if he doesn't, all of this remains valid, maybe just a bit less so. So a few steps that I think we can take to move in that direction. This is not an exhaustive list, we don't have time for that, but just to put some ideas on the table. Idea number one, and I am going to sound like a broken record, this is something that Vincent and I wrote in the Globe and Mail earlier this week. We need a national security policy, and we need regular national security policies. We haven't had one for 20 years, which when American colleagues hear that, they often find that fairly striking. The government committed last month, as part of its defense policy update, that it would produce not only one, but others on a regular basis. That's very good, but that's only obviously a first step, the next step being to actually do it. I will be very curious to see if a conservative government, assuming that if the polls are right, could very well be the next government within 12 to 18 months, will keep that commitment. And I hope they do. This is essential because ideally a national security policy is not just a PR document as it is sometimes or ideally is not just a PR document as it is sometimes dismissed as. It is ideally a serious exercise where you identify these priorities and trade-offs. One concrete application of what this can mean, it's AUKUS. It is, as far as I can tell, there's very limited public information on this, but as far as I can tell, it is Canada's position that we would like to be members of the second pillar of AUKUS, which is a series of working groups on emerging and disruptive technologies, not the first pillar, which is nuclear subs. For our research, Stephanie Carvin and I interviewed a number of officials from the 3 original AUKUS countries, and what they were telling us is that in principle, there is no objection to bring in other countries, not only Canada, perhaps Japan and South Korea too, but A, there's an issue of process. It's not clear what the process is yet to bring new members into AUKUS, and B, comes back to the point that AUKUS is a potluck in the sense that Canada has to make a case that it has something to bring to the table. And a national security policy review would contribute to that strategic exercise of identifying what's in it for us, but also what's in it for them to have us. Because remember that Canada's most important interest in the Indo-Pacific, in my view, is to be perceived as a capable and reliable ally by the United States. Item number 2, in terms of things we can do, is capacity, tools. There's a range of tools that we need to modernize, to establish. Very long list. I'll mention only one, not because it's the only one, but for reasons of time, as per the sign that I just saw in front of me. One of them, to counter foreign interference by China, to link to today's topic, is CSIS needs to enhance its ability to share information with those who are targets of foreign interference, but who are also partners in countering foreign interference. Who are partners in developing the societal resilience that in many cases is our first line of defense to counter foreign interference by China, but by others too. Civil society, universities, the private sector, and other levels of government in particular. Bill C-70 that was made public a few days ago would bring a lot of these important improvements. But beyond the necessary legislative changes, and I seriously hope that C-70 passes before we come to elections, we need cultural and organizational change as opposed to just legislation. We need mechanisms to share information and coordinate policies with other levels of government, which was, by the way, one of the recommendations of the Rouleau report that everybody's completely forgotten after the roughly 36 hours of life it had in the news cycle. We need cultural changes in organizations to be more transparent in engaging with civil society and the private sector. We need more transparency. In general. Democracies should leverage national security transparency much more in their struggle against autocracies, including but not only China. You sometimes hear senior intelligence community leaders say in public that when they are fighting against China or Russia or Iran, they fight with a hand tied behind their backs because unlike adversaries, they have to respect the rule of law. That's true, certainly in a tactical sense. But at another level, transparency and the accountability that comes with it is one of our most fundamental strengths in the fight against autocracies. And it is a strength that we should weaponize. And if you don't like the word weaponize, because it's not very nice, it's not very Canadian, you can use the word leverage instead, but I think it pretty much means the same. You can do that in multiple ways, but just to name one, the disclosure of intelligence. We saw the US, the UK, and on a smaller scale, but we did it, and it's a big improvement that we did, Canada, in the case of the war with Ukraine. If we learn the right lessons, there's a lot that we can do in other contexts than Ukraine. 5, and that's my last point, is human resources. And again, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record for Wesley and Vincent, who've heard me rant about this multiple times recently. It has to be included, even if everybody finds it boring. We have major gaps and challenges at the level of human resources. Recruitment shortages, retention challenges, cyber skills, for example, competing with the private sector, morale, in the intelligence community. CSIS regularly finishing last or second to last in cross-government employee surveys, which is a major problem. Backlogs for security clearances, which are also a catastrophe. It's a national security threat, fundamentally. We've had successive generations of leaders at the bureaucratic, but also at the political level, who have just passed the buck to their successors on issues of solving these human resources problems. And this is not just a purely administrative problem, because the reality is that in the absence of serious reform at this level, reforms, plans, strategies are going to remain reforms, plans, and strategies, because we are short on implementation capacity, which is as, if not more important than the strategy itself. And I'll finish with just an example to illustrate that. The Canadian Armed Forces right now are about 16,000 troops short of their authorized strength of 70,000. Right there, that's a huge problem. After years of a major blitz to increase recruitment, from what I understand, but I'm not exactly sure of the details, in the last year, for the first time in several years, they've been able to not have negative growth in the Canadian Forces, but the growth was actually very small. The commitments of the Defense Policy Update, released about a month ago, the committed commitments, not the exploratory commitments, would require about 14,000 additional troops in addition to the 16 that we're short of. So that's 30,000 troops that we're short. Increasing by 250 per year is going to take us 120 years to get to that level. Obviously, that math makes absolutely no sense, but it illustrates the point of how, if we don't have a major blitzkrieg on human resources challenges, we will suffer from problems in terms of implementation capacity on any new plan that we may have. And on that, I will stop.
Thanks very much, Tomas. My colleague Tomas knows a lot about the potential range of threats posed by the PRC to Canadian national security. So we may have a chance to go dig into that a little bit more, and I encourage you all, if you have a question about that, to address it to Tomas when we get to Q&A. The next speaker up is going to be Craig Singleton. So over to Craig.
Thank you. Good morning. Grateful to be here on behalf of the Foundation for Defensive Democracies. We're a nonpartisan research institute that's focused exclusively on foreign policy and national security. In my view, today the U.S. and Canada, we really stand at a critical juncture in our relations with China, particularly within the context of North American security. As we sort of peel back the layers of diplomatic engagement that often portray, I think, what is a facade of cooperation, we're confronted by this very stark reality that China is intent on pursuing policies that directly threaten our democratic values. Of course, these activities are not random, and they do not amount to mere disruptions. They are calculated, and in my view, quite insidious attempts to undermine our democratic institutions, our economic stability, and our national security from within. And they're only likely to intensify in the coming years. Fracturing the West through proxy wars in Europe and the Middle East, in my view, fits very neatly within Chinese Communist Party Chairman Xi Jinping's instructions to his bureaucratic foot soldiers to seek opportunity in international turmoil. Speaking before a seminar of CCP leaders in 2021, Xi remarked, quote, "The most important characteristic of the world is, in a word, chaos, and this trend appears likely to continue," quote. In that speech, Xi also noted the times and trends are on our side. Similarly, as Xi departed a Kremlin meeting in March 2023, he went further, effectively declaring himself and Mr. Putin agents of chaos. Xi said, quote, "Right now there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving those changes together," end quote. For the purposes of today's talk, I wanted to focus on two key facets of Chinese malign influence, cyber warfare, and then also disinformation operations aimed at meddling in our democracies. In the realm of cyber warfare, the threat from China is both sophisticated and pernicious. Right now, China and other adversaries are deftly maneuvering within our networks. And I think it's fair to say that the front line in today's digital arms race is our own communications networks, the very backbone of our modern societies. China's cyber tactics are not merely about gathering intelligence. Increasingly, they're aimed at introducing significant vulnerabilities that could cripple our critical infrastructure when we least expect it. Put differently, these hackers are not simply seeking access to our networks. They are preemptively positioning to compromise and control them. According to the U.S. Defense Department's cyber strategy, China's peacetime penetration of our networks directly informs its preparations for potential future conflict, blurring the lines between peace and war. On that point, the People's Liberation Army itself has long prioritized in its strategic doctrine the targeting, penetrating, and compromising of what they term are, quote, information detection sources, information channels, and information processing and decision-making systems, end quote. The goal of those operations, according to PLA planners, is very clear: to sap the enemy's morale, disintegrate their will to fight, and ignite anti-war sentiment, all without firing a single conventional weapon. And that's a direct quote lifted from PLA doctrine. The recently exposed Volt Typhoon operation, I think, is a stark reminder of this reality. All told, this Chinese state-directed cyber initiative saw Chinese hackers manipulate thousands of network devices around the world, including the United States and Canada, laying the groundwork for potential catastrophic disruptions at naval ports, internet service providers, and key utility sectors. Chinese hackers did not just happen upon these targets. These are vital points in our communications infrastructure, which were chosen, I believe, to maximize disruption and potentially, in the words of Jen Easterly, induce societal panic. As we look ahead to the next generation of communications technologies, China is already laying the groundwork to dominate these arenas as well. Their proactive positioning at the standard-setting bodies like the International Telecommunications Union aims to advance global telecommunications norms that favor Chinese technologies and China's strategic interests. Such moves are, in my view, a clear indication that China likely intends to embed dependencies in next-generation technologies that could be exploited for intelligence gathering, but also just to gain geopolitical leverage. Turning to disinformation, Chinese efforts to manipulate public perception and influence political outcomes are becoming far more refined and pervasive. China routinely leverages social media platforms to spread false narratives, create fake news stories, and amplify divisive issues that sway public opinion and disrupt the political stability of our nations. The recent elections in Taiwan, I think, have shown as much. They've shown the lengths to which China will go to wield disinformation to ensure favorable outcomes to its geopolitical interests. As the top target of disinformation globally, Taiwan faced an onslaught of false narratives designed to undermine the ruling Democratic Progressive Party and to bolster other parties perceived as favoring closer ties to Beijing. And that's exactly what happened. These tactics are now being replicated in our own backyard. Indeed, the US intelligence community has warned about Chinese interference in the upcoming 2024 presidential election, having already declassified information about Chinese meddling during the 2022 midterms. In the United States, we're also seeing clear attempts by Chinese actors to manipulate state-level elections through covert funding, disinformation, and the cultivation of political allies. These efforts are aimed to sow discord, erode trust in democratic institutions, and diminish our ability to project global influence. The impact of these campaigns is, in my view, quite profound. By casting doubt on the legitimacy of our electoral processes, China aims to create a pervasive sense of mistrust and cynicism amongst our electorate, and around the world as well. The urgency of addressing these and other threats, I don't think can be overstated. And if left unchecked, I suspect Chinese disinformation and cyber interference will continue to grow in terms of sophistication and intensity. And that path forward requires a robust and unified response from Canada and the United States. All told, it goes without saying that we must enhance our defensive and offensive capabilities, not only to deter and withstand these threats, but also to preserve the core values that underpin our societies. For starters, to counter cyber threats, enhancing our cybersecurity frameworks is a must. That includes not only bolstering our networks against intrusions, but also developing capabilities to track and potentially even retaliate in real time against cyber aggressions. The collaboration between our nations in sharing intelligence and cybersecurity technologies and know-how is going to be crucial in that endeavor. Similarly, to counter disinformation, the democratic world's defenses need to be hardened. We need to do that by equipping government officials, journalists, political parties, the private sector, civil society, and the general public with the tools and information they need to reduce their exposure to Chinese malign discourse. Efforts also have to be made to modernize campaign finance, counter interference, and espionage laws to enhance transparency, and disclosure requirements for individuals and entities acting on behalf of China, as well as to toughen sanctions and enforcement provisions to deter potential violators. Of course, the government cannot do all of this alone, which is going to mean a huge rethink of public-private partnerships. Of particular importance, in my view, is the need for enhanced coordination in the civic technology space to identify and respond to what are very clear Chinese discourse provocations. Last, in the arena of international diplomacy, I think we have to be much more vigilant, and this is an area where I think Canada has a major role to play. We can't allow some of these Chinese overtures of perceived cooperation to distract us from the underlying strategic maneuvers that threaten our national interests. I'll pause there. Thank you so much again for having me, and I'll turn back my remaining time.
Craig, thanks very much. We're going to turn to Nicole Giles next. CSIS produces, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, produces an annual public report, which is one avenue by which and through which Canadian public can hear about contemporary perceptions of threat. So I'm going to turn it to Nicole, and she may well want to address that report.
I think it's automatic.
All right, thank you very much. I have to say I'm very pleased to be here. I'm still a bit of a recovering academic after 20 years in the public service, so it's very exciting when I get to participate in these types of panels. For those of you who have been watching the news here in Canada, it's been a pretty busy week for us between the release of the report from the public inquiry on foreign interference. Yes, the release of our public report. I slipped him a 20 before this to advertise it. That was tabled by our Minister in Parliament on Monday. We also had the tabling introduction, rather, of our legislation to make some pretty substantive changes that are really once in a generation to the CSIS Act as part of Bill C-70. And the reason I mention those is that they're all pretty on point for what we're talking about here today in terms of both the impact of PRC's efforts to threaten our very institutions, as has been very well described by my fellow panelists here, but also in terms of the Canada-US relationship and how we need to be tackling all of these things together. So there's really three key messages I want to try to take you through. The first is talking a little bit about Canada-US interdependence and how I actually think it's a strength that we can use in terms of how we counter the threats that are being posed by PRC and quite frankly as well other authoritarian regimes. Second of all, talking a little bit about the imperative of taking a whole of society approach across not just levels of government, but different sectors of society. And third, talking a little bit about how we need to up our game in terms of transparency and how our ability to be transparent is actually one of the things that distinguishes us from the PRC and also enables us to be resilient. Now, the good news is that this intersects beautifully with the comments of the previous two panelists, and do promise you that there was no covert collaboration that occurred prior to the panel, recognizing that I'm in a forum where collaboration is a good word in academia and not a bad one, as it is in my business. So in terms of Canadian-US interdependence, I think that we sometimes look at it, and especially after COVID, where we saw some of the challenges from an economic perspective, supply chain, as thinking about it as a bad thing. But I actually want to challenge the premise a little bit of the idea of convergence or divergence with the U.S. And that's a little bit nerve-wracking for me. Vincent's a former boss of mine, but I'll forge ahead with it. Is that regardless of whether this convergence or divergence with the U.S., that interdependency is going to exist and is something that we need to tackle, and we need to figure out how we manage it. And I think that interdependence acts as a real strength for us because it means that our relationship with the U.S. is never transactional. It's not a single engagement. It's something that's incredibly enduring. And when we talk about that, we have to think about how we can really leverage that in a meaningful way. And automatically, of course, we think about intelligence sharing and the information that continues to flow back and forth between us and our U.S. colleagues is really constant and persistent, but also in how we align some of the tools that have been mentioned. So, for example, if we're thinking about the Investment in Canada Act, if we're not closing and putting the guardrails around that in the same way similar US legislation is, we're leaving huge chinks in the chain. And that allows there to be a penetration from the PRC into whatever economic area that might be. And so it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're not acting as the weak link in that chain, but it's also incumbent upon us to make sure that we're coordinating well with the US to ensure that as we look at how we build that fortress North America, that we're doing it in a way that serves both of our interests and the way that we're thinking about it together. The second thing that I want to touch on is the imperative of the whole of society approach across both the Canada and the US. And those of you who have heard my stump speech about the reasons why we need changes to the CSIS Act, it is somewhat similar. And that's that the targets have changed from 40 years ago in 1984 when the CSIS Act was written. The crown jewels are not just held in the federal government. They're held across all levels of government, and not just provincial and territorial, but of course Indigenous. It's held within our communities. It's held certainly within our businesses. And so because the targets from our adversaries, including of course foremost amongst that the PRC, are no longer just the federal government, they're at whole of society, that means our response also has to be whole of society in terms of our approach. And so the way that we are able to try to create concerted partnerships with emerging technology researchers, with companies, to enable us to combat the advances and the growing acceleration of PRC in the area, for example, quantum or AI, where, by the way, PRC is stockpiling data in order to just wait for when quantum computing gets to a point where they'll be able to mine all of that information. The only way we're going to be able to combat that is not just by Canadian concerted partnerships with the emerging technologies, but it has to be in conjunction with the US and the US's concerted partnerships with the same organizations. And so that's one of the reasons why you saw David Vigneault and his colleagues from across the other Five Eyes come together last October at Palo Alto. And for the first time, you saw the heads of service come together publicly and also issue a statement about the need for us to collaborate together in order to protect our societies in the way to ensure that we're tackling those emerging technologies together. Also part of this, of course, is the foreign interference that we see. We see the transnational repression against communities. I always like to talk about the Arctic in this space as well, which is really a great example of where you see the cross and the penetration across businesses, communities, levels of government. But the point here from a CSIS perspective is not that we shouldn't be doing collaboration in the scientific area, the technological area with the PRC. It's that we need to do it with our eyes wide open and in an informed way where we can understand and mitigate the threats, which brings me to my last point, which is that our ability to be transparent is also what drives our ability to be resilient. And so some of you have probably heard David Vigneault say before that CSIS needs to step out of the shadows. Well, what you see laid out in our fine annual report this year is we're talking about how it's our job to actually shine the light, not just step out of the shadows. And so what we mean by that is that by being more transparent, that's what will enable us to build trust with Canadians, build trust with businesses. We have a very strong relationship with the Business Council of Canada that's built upon that. And only by having the awareness of those threats are we able to ensure that we can combat them and we can empower all these sectors to be able to identify and combat the threats. Now, we are, as Tomas said, in the fight right now in the alley with one hand tied behind the back, and that we're limited by our legislation in terms of sharing information outside the federal government. But if we're able to see those changes, that's going to really fundamentally change the way that we can build that resilience across society, and quite frankly, in a way that our U.S. partners are able to. So that's part of us holding up our part of the bargain in this. but also will enable us to be far more strategic in how we use the disclosure of intelligence to be able to combat the misinformation and the disinformation, and to be able to really get into the battle on how we combat that narrative from the PRC in a way that we're not fully able to right now. And also finally, just to end on part of the way as well that we at CSIS right now see transparency is not just external, but also internal to our own organization. Our own house has to be in order. And that's why we're undertaking initiatives such as establishing Office of the Ombuds within CSIS, which will help us to ensure that that transparency exists in a really profound way. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Nicole, thanks. I think it's fair to say Canada has historically lagged far behind the United States in terms of transparency on national security issues. Maybe we're catching up. Over to Robert.
Thank you. 3 excellent presentations, and I agree with almost everything that has been said. This is going to be the yes, but, or maybe the yes, and part of the presentation against all this background. The concern about Chinese influence operations really began or was amplified, became whole of society, due to the work of an Australian journalist, John Garneau, who around 2017 wrote about the Australian case, which is perhaps more comparable to the Canadian case than is the United States. And he pointed out that the concern about influence was Chinese actions that were covert, coercive, and corrupting. This was then amplified in September of 2017 by the work of a New Zealand scholar, Anne-Marie Brady, in her Magic Weapons essay, which I actually published at the Wilson Center the day that she sent it to me. It was very important, warning about Chinese United Front operations. And this was what really began the degree of attention that we have seen to this. The worry at this time was that our policy of engagement with China and our openness, and this is, I think, true for both of the North American partners, was naive in ways that made us vulnerable. And China was exploiting it to have an impact on communities, institutions, and opinions on our own soil. This is in the early days during the engagement period. And the focus of government and media attention on Chinese influence operations in those days was mostly on China trying to shape narratives and buy silence through Hollywood, the NBA, universities, and corporations that had a financial stake in China. Those accusations, broadly speaking, were true and were important. We know this because South Park amplified them in one of its episodes. But there was always a bit of a proportionality problem when we talked about Chinese influence in North America. One was that even despite all of these nefarious, strategic, and very well-funded efforts of China, of course, their influence on us and our societies pales in comparison to our influence on them and what we have had for decades. And I think that we need to bear that in mind because it has an impact on the way that China sees the influence debate. You can go to any corner in any Chinese city, turn 360 degrees, and you will not see one manifestation, visible manifestation of Chinese modernization that has nothing to do with the United States and the West. It's everywhere. So there's a proportionality issue there. And there's also a proportionality, I think, when we start speaking about the values debate and the ways in which Chinese influence can be morally corrosive, which I think is true, and I'll come back to that. But I would put that about 75 places below the popularity of Family Guy in terms of big cultural influences that concern me. So we need to have a sense of proportionality. The week before last, I was in New York to brief Samuel Paparo, the new commander-in-chief of the Indo-Pacific Command. And the day before I briefed him, I got up there earlier and I took a walk through Central Park. It was a beautiful April afternoon, sunny in Central Park. And it was spectacular. I'd never seen it so crowded with people just from all over the world doing all the things you do in Central Park and taking delight in nature and in each other. It was just a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I asked myself 2 questions because I'm thinking about briefing Paparo the next day. 1, where is the Chinese influence here? The answer is indiscernible. And the second question is, does China despise this? Does China seek to destroy this? Does China want to see this burn? And the answer there, I think, again, is no. So what are we talking about when we speak of a China threat? What is the proportionality question? So this is how this debate began, but we're in a different era now. We are not naive. We are in what I think is already a new kind of Cold War. I don't insist on people using that language, but it is certainly an era in which we recognize that China's subsequent economic or technological development or any increase in its soft power is in fact instrumental to, weaponized for, China's development of comprehensive national power, which is in opposition to our own. And I think that the answer to the threat question, the big threat question, is the threat of the Chinese Communist Party legitimizing its illiberal domestic practices of governance internationally. That, I think, is what we're ultimately talking about. But we're still talking about this as the Chinese influence problem. And so the rest of the time, I would like to try to convince you that that's the wrong framework. We shouldn't still be using the word influence, because it fails to distinguish the trivial from the annoying from the genuinely threatening. It tends to lump it all together. And we are speaking of the peripheral issues, like the dotted line in the Barbie movie, or I would argue even Confucius Institutes, and lumping those together with the urgent issues, which I think are the ones that Craig just outlined. And if we conflate the peripheral and the urgent, I think we tend to take our eye off the ball of urgency. And so what I would like to offer just briefly is kind of a quick new typology of influence to suggest where we should put our focus, and I'm going to land, sort of where Craig did. First, when we speak of influence with China, and I'm going to come at you as a bit of a machine gun because I'm getting timing messages from up front, I would like to invoke the Janice Stein version of time, if I might. And this one, just quickly. So we speak of influence, first and foremost, the first category I would say is organic influence. China is in the world, and organic influence includes the flows of people into our countries, the flows and the enrichment of ideas, the enrichment of our culture, interest in Chinese language study, in the academic study of China itself. And this kind of organic influence must be welcomed and protected, no matter where it emanates from. So that, I think, is number one. Organic influence has benefited us both. And with that organic influence, we also get debate, a range of views in our countries about the nature of the China challenge or China relations. And that difference also has to be protected. I hear in Washington people saying, for example, the financier Ray Dalio or the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, should have to register as foreign agents because what they say supports the goals of the Chinese Communist Party. No, they shouldn't. That is odious, and that itself is a huge danger. I actually disagree very strongly with Ray Dalio, and I disagree with Tim Cook, and I disagree with many Americans sincerely held different views about China, and those have to be cherished and protected. So this is one of the dangers of overstating the threat from Chinese influence, is turning against that kind of debate. And again, we benefit from global influence. Right now, the poster child for this is The Three-Body Problem, Liu Cixin's book, which won the Hugo Award, and is now an actually not so good show on Netflix. But the point is that with organic influence, we can let the market decide whether an idea or a movie or a novel or whatever it is worthy or not. And the market has done a good job of that. We're not embracing, Chinese pop culture crap. They've had very little success with spreading soft power. No government action is needed. Number two is propaganda, which is of two sorts. One is overt Chinese government propaganda, which falls into the realm of public diplomacy. Again, largely ineffective, and this, I think, needs to be permitted. We all engage in public diplomacy and propaganda of certain kinds when it is overtly sponsored by the government. We also need to counter it through our own public discourse. Then there's the question of covert propaganda, and this is where it starts to get more insidious. And this includes what we call influence operations. This is the buying up of Chinese language media throughout North America. Other aspects of United Front work, which is covert. This is John Garneau's covert piece. It includes targeted misinformation, the silencing of criticism, and the intimidation of our citizens. This cannot be tolerated. This has to be exposed, and insofar as it can be, eliminated. A subset of that, which I know is very important to Canadian colleagues and it's important in the United States, is China working through diaspora populations. I don't have time to go into detail on this, but I think that our primary strategy in countering diaspora operations needs to be the protection of our own people, our own Chinese Canadian and Chinese American citizens, because there is an undercurrent of racism that runs through a lot of this influence operation discourse that we must be attentive to. Then there is political and corporate espionage proper. We recognize that needs to be prosecuted. We know how to deal with that. And then lastly, and this is why I dislike the phrase influence operations, there are the things that Craig was talking about, cyber warfare and attacks on democracy, disinformation of that kind that is designed to undermine the system and cause us direct harm. These should not be called influence operations. These should be called grayscale attacks, recognized as such. And so, again, this is why we don't lump that with Barbie and whether the map was correct or not, because it trivializes the urgent. And this is what John Garneau would have described as the corruption piece. It includes hacking, the placing of malware, and that really does need to be treated and called, as I say, a grayscale attack within a competitive or Cold War, or whatever word you like to use as context. And then lastly, and I echo all three of my co-panelists here, these approaches to the different aspects of influence, this kind of typology, must also be reflected in our global diplomacy. We have to help other countries to make these same distinctions. And as has been suggested, I think that our banner here needs to be not so much democracy as transparency and sunlight. And this needs to be a major aspect of the work that we are doing. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Robert, thanks very much. Listen, I think I'm going to change things up, partly given that Robert has taken on Janice's concept of time. I do really want to get to an audience Q&A. We've heard various interesting phrases in terms of the central question here about a sort of shared concept of North American security, challenged by potential Chinese PRC threats. We've heard from Nicole about the interdependence piece and how that operates, and from Robert, importantly, about issues of approaching these threats in a proportional and more sophisticated manner than we tend to do. So I'm simply going to, at this point, I think rather my original plan was to turn to each of the panelists and give them a sort of elevator pitch time to respond to what they've heard. But I'm going to turn it over to the audience instead, as long as my panelists are okay with that. So please come forward with questions, and particularly questions that might address the key issue of, do we have a shared perception between Canada and the United States of the threats? And how do we, if we do have that shared perception, how do we operationalize it in combination? So thanks, please.
Good morning. Great panel yet again. I think the American-Canadian alliance and where we're moving together on the issue of combating China and their extensive threat to freedom and democracy is great. Thank you for publishing Anne-Marie Brady's paper. I'm also president of the China Democracy Fund, who helped defend Anne-Marie Brady and brought her case forward. And we see that kind of transnational repression of individuals who are colleagues and peers in the academic circle. We see it in the Uyghur community. When I was at the Munich Security Conference a couple of months ago, simultaneously when we were in the Murat and the crash with the Uyghur people, we had to listen to Yang Ji, which I just want to quote this. Certain political forces have spread too many lies about Xinjiang and produced too many false information around the world. The so-called genocide is such a big lie. Now, this is a regime that continues to perpetrate the fact that we're not using slave labor, but at the same time, I was listening.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. We really want to hear a question for the panel.
The question is, our recent enactment of new legislation on foreign interference, and where do you think we're doing enough, and where should we fill in the gaps to ensure foreign interference is really stopped in our country by all blind state actors?
Great, thank you for that. Yeah. who would like to respond? So the question is really, we have just introduced legislation, who knows when it'll pass, to deal with aspects of foreign interference. Maybe I could turn it over just quickly to Tomas and Nicole, because they'll be most familiar with this.
Very Canadian, offering each other to go first. I think that's a great question, and I think that there's always opportunities to do more. What we've really been focusing on, and what you'll see in Bill C-70, is within the CSIS Act aspect, we're looking to up our game on the ability to share information to build resilience. We're looking to enable CSIS to operate in a digital world, which means making some pretty badly needed adjustments to our data set regime, for example, to give us more than 90 days to decrypt, translate hundreds of thousands of pieces of data. Also looking at plugging some other pretty big gaps in terms of our ability to collect information, foreign intelligence from within Canada that's stored outside Canada. But I think that fundamentally we do need to also consider how those additional tools will be operationalized within the broader policy of the Government of Canada. And I think that looking at how we build a national security policy that, in my personal opinion, actually needs to be more of an international policy that pulls together industrial policy, economic policy, development policy, foreign policy, defense policy. How do we as a country figure out how to pull all the threads or all the levers, depending on your preferred metaphor, at the same time, to allow us to really be fully magnifying what all those tools are. So I think that it's great if we have the changes to the CSIS Act, and I spent the better part of my life over the last 15 months on that, so I'm not diminishing the importance of it, but we need to make sure that we're pulling all together on that, and it goes back to that point about how do we ensure that all of society is pulling, including provinces, territories, businesses. So we have a lot to do on that coordination piece, and make sure that we have the right policy framework for it.
So the question, are we doing enough? I'll try to answer that in about a minute and a half. Well, the easy answer is no. But I would say, if you want to be glass half full, that steps taken recently, such as Bill C-70, are steps in the right direction. But clearly with the massive caveat that there's a huge black cloud over Bill C-70, which is, will there be enough time before elections, which we don't even know when they will be, but at the latest next fall. So hopefully it gets adopted, but it has to be seen as a first step, not the end of the story. What else? Very quickly, a list. First of all, everything I said about implementation capacity. If we don't work on that, the boring, hard, in the weeds work of solving a lot of these issues, there's a low ceiling for success for that. Everything I said about transparency that other speakers mentioned, a national security policy, I would add to that something I didn't mention, which is a foreign policy review, right? Would be nice to see how that fits with national security. Money. Which is hugely problematic because we have a deficit, and let's not get into the debate about where that deficit came from. There's a deficit. So either this government or a hypothetical conservative government in the future will have to deal with a deficit. Exactly how, we'll see, but more money for national security and defense and and foreign policy will be difficult. A lot of reforms that we need can be cost-free. That's absolutely true, or at least low cost, but a lot of other reforms have to cost money, and they may not come, or at least not fully. I would also add a point that one fear that I have in recent debates that we've had in Canada is that we've been focusing too much on the electoral interference aspect of foreign interference, which you touched a bit on, others touched on. To me, transnational repression outside of electoral cycles, and of course in the real world you can't always neatly disentangle them, but transnational repression that is really just trying to shut down, intimidate, blackmail, beat up, in extreme cases kill democracy activists from India, from Iran, on which I work a lot, from Saudi Arabia, from Turkey, right? Technically, not technically, a NATO ally, in addition to China and others. is a huge problem outside of the electoral dimension. And I hope that we can focus some of our attention on that too. There's two other points that I'd mention quickly in terms of what else can we do? Are we doing enough? Another is governance. The governance of the national security community has evolved in recent years, for example, with the creation of the two major oversight and review bodies, NCCOP and CIRA. And some people in the room here were actively involved in setting these bodies up. There's a lot that still needs to be done to modernize and improve our governance. Is the center strong enough, for example? And to my mind, the answer to that is no, but there's a debate to have at that level. And the last point I'll mention is national security literacy within the policy and political world is too low in our country. It has improved a lot compared to where it was 10 years ago, but it still needs to improve a lot. And I would also add to that the reverse, which is policy literacy in the intelligence community, i.e. how well do people in CSIS, in CBSA, in the RCMP, in CSC, how well do they understand the policy world? How well do they understand the political world? How well do they understand how elections work, for example? And the answer to that is not well enough. Like intelligence literacy on the policy side, it has improved, but it still has a long way to go, in my mind.
Can I just add briefly, I think from the US context, it's difficult. We don't know what we don't know yet about some of this challenge. And one area where we need to have greater transparency, and I think Robert touched upon this too, and I largely agree with his comments, is on lobbying and influence and sort of understanding the extent and scope of what's occurring. In the United States, we have the Foreign Agent Registration Act. It was designed to counter the Nazis in the 1930s. Hasn't sort of kept up with reality. And I think one thing that we have learned, primarily because of Chinese national security laws and Chinese state directives, is that the line between private companies and the party state has more or less been eliminated by design. And so companies, for example, most recently in the United States, involving TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, one of the things that we did at our FDD was we helped map out the linkages between ByteDance's corporate leadership and the United Front. And it should surprise no one here that 7 of the top 10 leaders at ByteDance are open United Front operatives. They openly participate and talk about those activities on ByteDance's own website. And I think the challenge is that in the United States, ByteDance isn't required to disclose the millions of dollars that it spends to influence the American public, to influence the legislative process. And so increasingly what we need to start to do is to recognize the legal reality in China through the national security laws, the recently revised counter-espionage law, the 2016 cybersecurity law, which governs and mandates data, that these companies are operating on behalf of and in partnership with the party state. And so that's not to say that those companies have to be ejected. It just simply means that we have to understand what they're spending money on, who they're attempting to influence, where that money is going in the world of dark web politics and a whole host of sort of dark circles that are in American and I would imagine Canadian politics. And so that transparency can be very, very helpful to just shed a light on what they're doing so that the American public and the American people can see the extent and scope of those activities. And I can give an example in the United States. China spends more on known and declared lobbying and influence activities than all other countries combined in the United States. Combined. I think we should have a little bit of insight into what those activities are seeking to achieve and what they're doing and who they're meeting with. And that doesn't say they can't do things. It just means that we should know what they're doing.
Robert, thanks for that. I must, just by way of a footnote, of course, Canada struggled with some very similar issues when it came to ultimately deciding to ensure that Huawei, for example, could not be part of our rollout of 5G telecommunications networks, trying to understand the nature of that company and its influence in relations to the PRC. I'll turn it over to our next questioner. Can I just ask you to introduce yourself?
Yes. I'm Jim Millward from Georgetown University, and I have a question about universities. And thinking about Robert's typology of influence and thinking about, where do the universities fall in this? There's a kind of schizophrenic approach, I think, to this. I mean, we've heard, at least speaking mainly about the United States, which I know better, we've heard through the ill-fated China initiative, universities being treated basically as sort of nests of Chinese espionage, places where we're worrying about the nuclear secrets being picked up off of the desk of somebody's dissertation advisor or whatever, right? And talked about that way. We've had, I think it was Stephen Miller under the Trump administration, seriously proposing that all Chinese visas, that all Chinese students should be denied visas. And we've seen some of these kind of things happening. So on the one hand, I think there's been what is generally, I hope generally thought to be kind of an excessive or at least a ham-fisted overreaction to these kinds of things. What I've seen, though from my own experience, is that actually many Chinese scholars and Chinese students are themselves actually victims of Chinese influence operations, victims of transnational repression in particular. And they're very vulnerable in university situations because it's very easy for people to keep an eye on them and report back and so on. So I guess I'd like to ask Robert, but also anyone on the panel, how do you think we should go forward dealing with the issue of universities with the large numbers of Chinese students whom I think we all want to, agree we want to continue welcoming as part of this positive organic interactions that you mentioned. How do we go forward in an atmosphere when there is increased tensions? And I think in a bipartisan way, the politicians are going to be less and less willing to defend any Chinese student, any Chinese people against these kinds of accusations.
Yeah. The difficulty comes up because the original suspicions about what China might want to do on our campuses to take advantage of internationalization and openness, I think those are legitimate, even necessary suspicions. They're correct about the goals and the methods of the Communist Party and the way that they work through students and Chinese university persons. So those suspicions broadly are correct. But, Confucius Institutes are not hotbeds of espionage. They're hotbeds of mediocre Mandarin language training. And despite the China Initiative, not for want of trying, did not get one successful prosecution of espionage on American campuses. Not one, zero, very low number. What they did get are a bunch of cases of program fraud, which none of us knew was a crime about 5 or 6 years ago. So again, you say ham-fisted, wrong-minded. It's tough to say, but we haven't really. It hasn't played out, and the China Initiative was extremely vigorous, and I think it failed in that, and that was why it was canceled. In terms of the answer, how do we deal with that? I think that the answer is strengthened university self-governance and vigilance. Congress is not qualified to run American higher education. As you've seen, we don't really want, Elise Stefanik running the Ivy League, right? If we look at some of her recent hearings. And the universities have stepped up so that they have, I think that during the prosecution of the China Initiative and even when it fell apart, actually there was a great deal of mutual learning, such that Congressman Michael Gallagher, when he was running the select committee hearings on this, began by saying, of course we value the openness and internationalization of our universities. That must be preserved. And university leaders now acknowledge the genuine threat. And I think that the best model for this is probably the one that MIT came up with for self-governance and the right degree of vigilance that gets the balance about right, but it should be the universities themselves and not government. That's my answer.
I think I would take a slightly divergent perspective than Robert, and I appreciate that. I think we need more common sense guardrails than what's being discussed here, and it would be, I think, a mistake to ignore the extent of what military-civil fusion is and how China's evolving model of state capitalism intentionally has weaponized its own civilian universities to advance its military objectives. You could look at universities like Sichuan University in China, where they literally make Chinese nuclear warheads on campus. These are partnerships. Sichuan University maintains partnerships with MIT. MIT is under no requirement to publish and disclose any details about those partnerships. They're not required at all to disclose financial flows. They're not required to disclose how they screen and vet those people. They're not required to disclose whether Chinese scientists from Sichuan or Ocean University, which makes Chinese nuclear submarines, is involved in potentially unclassified, but still cutting edge technologies. And I do think that there should be, at least at a bare minimum, a transparency requirement that if these schools are going to receive in some excess millions of dollars from problematic Chinese universities that the Chinese government has tapped to produce and be a part of military civil fusion, we should understand what those linkages look like. No university in the United States is required to disclose those partnerships at all. Let's start there. If you have them, disclose them. I do think there's an opportunity for brain drain here, though. And I think to Robert's point, maybe this is one area where we might agree, is that so many of these Chinese students see opportunity here and they see a lack of opportunity in China, which is why you have so many of them staying here in the United States. You can contrast this with the lack of American students that are being granted opportunities to study in China, let alone be a part of cutting edge technology at Chinese universities. So I do think there's a tremendous opportunity here to incentivize many of those students to stay in the United States, to continue to advance and contribute to our societies and communities, and to give them an opportunity to have some self-determination over their lives.
I don't disagree with trying to get more transparency there, but I would say legislate it. Don't just invite presidents in and intimidate them.
Oh,
You know,
totally.
do this responsibly, and then also do it consistently. One of the issues I would have with the select committee is they're very concerned about influence, and who do they go after? Universities, Hollywood, and Silicon Valley, all of which they think are hopelessly woke anyway. It's been conflated with a general assault on universities. And yet these same people are very strongly supportive of, American agricultural exports to China. Look, this is a really, really easy game to play if we have to play it. An army travels on its belly. How do we know that American calories are not going into the stomachs of the PLA, or God forbid, a member of the Chinese Communist Party, and on and on and on? So we need to, yes, be vigilant, but I think that we also need to be not conflate it with some of our domestic political concerns, which I think we've seen happening in spades.
I'm just going to let a couple of other panelists have a quick word and get in one final question.
Very quickly, I think this is an area where we've tried to strike a bit of a balance here. So we did have recently published some guidelines for our universities on collaboration with PRC institutions and universities for organizations that are receiving grants from the Canadian government. And what fundamentally underlies that is the recognition that everything that is done is dual use. Everything that is done that looks completely innocent could actually be put towards a military dual-use principle, and also recognizes the national security law sitting underneath it. But it's putting the responsibility on the universities themselves to put in place their own governance. Now, the downside of that is that the universities are now trying to hire CSIS people to go run their VP research and security departments, but this is an area where we're seeing that collaboration come forward because there's the responsibility being put on the institution themselves, and those guidelines, while not perfect, certainly are a really good start.
I would just make the quick point to add to all that, maybe taking a step back, that the very quick point I made in answer to the previous question on national security literacy in the rest of the world and policy literacy within the intelligence world, those weaknesses explain well some of the dynamics that we've seen in relations between the national security community and universities. I think that's true in other contexts, like foreign interference for sure. In universities, national security literacy is very low. It has improved in recent years, including thanks to the hiring of former CSIS people in a number of key Canadian universities. But in universities, the resistance and mistrust towards, and this is a quote that I have literally heard, but dealing with the Gestapo is something that is hugely problematic. And I hear that all the time from my colleagues, that we don't trust them, we don't want to deal with them, they're inventing threats, they want to infringe on academic freedom, et cetera, et cetera. You hear that all the time. The relations are getting better compared to where they were, say, 10 years ago, but there's still a long way to go. And it's easy to just blame academics for that, and it's not completely wrong. But the part of the blame also goes with the government and the intelligence community because of the lack of transparency, because of the lack of engagement, because of the complete lack of sharing information in the past, even though, as we've said, and I absolutely think that's true, it's better. And the reverse is also true in the sense that in those first interactions between intelligence organizations and universities, intelligence organizations showed a poor understanding of how universities work with, for example, and here my colleague profs are going to laugh, the idea that if you tell something to the president of the university, profs are going to know let alone care. Right? That's just not how it works. And by now, and Professor Paul Thiel thinks this is pretty funny. It's better today, but it's not where it needs to be.
Tomas, thanks. Vince, do we have time for one more question? Okay, so I don't want to disrupt the order, but I would love to hear a question from a student in the audience. Can I put some, sorry, I apologize. Do you mind if we go to this student? And it'll have to be very quick.
Thanks, David. My name is Adam. I'm from McGill University. I have a follow-up question for Craig. Last month, President Biden signed into law an effective ban or forced sale of TikTok from ByteDance. How do you think the government of Canada should address security concerns relating to TikTok? Do you believe an incoming conservative government here in Canada might follow this direction?
Thanks. Full disclosure, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies was involved in drafting and supporting that legislation, so full disclosure. Primarily, as I mentioned, sort of mapping out the linkages between the parent companies and then helping members of Congress understand how Chinese national security laws play a role in the data aggregation that I think Nicole really talked about beautifully here. The Chinese are collecting reams of data and they don't quite know what to do with it, but they have big plans. And so my view is that most people, and at least members of Congress that I have engaged with and members of the executive branch, as we were all collaborating on writing that bill and helping explain it to the American population, was that there was a real knowledge deficit amongst even members of Congress, including those involved in China issues, about how all of these facets play together, the linkages between ByteDance and China's United Front Work Department, how Chinese national security laws work, how data harvesting could be potentially damaging. And I think that there was just a broad recognition that as you even looked at intricate data in TikTok of what was being amplified and maybe what was being suppressed in comparison to other platforms, and I think Rutgers had the best, by far the best sort of statistical and quantitative analysis on this, is that there was a major issue here. And I think that what maybe works in the United States might not, and most likely might not work in other places like Canada. Our view was a forced divestiture was consistent with American law. This bill was written in close partnership with the Department of Justice. Lisa Monaco in particular has been out there publicly. The reason was because she knew that it needed to withstand judicial scrutiny, and we all feel very confident that it will be. Whether the Chinese will sell by TikTok, they've said publicly they won't, and you sort of have to ask yourself a little bit of the why. TikTok is not a moneymaker. It doesn't generate value or revenue in any way, shape, or form in comparison to other social media platforms. And you sort of, all the investors in TikTok will make billions of dollars when it eventually does sell. But the reason is because it's Xi Jinping's most powerful secret weapon to influence US public opinion and global opinion. And I think that if we ignore that reality, I think it's a mistake. And I don't agree with some of the extreme hardliners on either side. But I do think it's very, very important that the people on a tactical level, the users, but also policymakers understand the scope of how that app works, and what worked in the United States most certainly won't work in other places. Other countries have just,
Craig, sorry, thanks. Yeah. I would just say in a Canadian context, I think the debate is going to be more about WeChat. But that's,
which no one is attempting to ban in the United States.
we'll take the lead on that then.
We'll follow you on that one.
And I hope that Mr. Pratt will, I hope I'm not in trouble for refusing the chance of a former Minister of National Defense to ask a question, but please forgive me, David. We do have to close this panel at this stage, but I'm sure there'll be other opportunities. So can I ask you all to join me in thanking our panelists for a great presentation?